As a Jordan fan of 25 years, watching his rookie games, I just find them fascinating. Not to mention the first-time reactions of commentators who had seen very little of him, and especially with that jump that he made from being obviously a very good player in college at North Carolina to the rookie phenom that he was in 85. It was all brand new to them then.
Yeah, that's a great point. Very rarely you'll see some of the stuff that we'll be actually chatting about that relates to this rookie season and even prior to that, the lead up to the actual Olympic Games themselves, which I've found quite fascinating as we've been researching along the way as well. So some good times ahead.
I always like to say that Michael got to play with me for a year at North Carolina. I think it really helped him.
Spectacular player from the beginning.
You can see right away Jordan was going to be a big-time scorer.
And showed what an impact he was going to have on the league.
This is NB85, celebrating the 30-year anniversary of Michael Jordan's rookie season in the NBA. And now, your hosts, Adam Ryan and Aaron Steen.
I'd like to welcome to the show today a good friend of mine. He's joined me many times as a co-host, and now he's taking part in a new project that we've got, which we're dubbing NB85. And we're going to be focusing on the 1985 NBA season and all things about that. Aaron Steen, how are you, Aaron?
Adam, thank you for having me back, mate.
No worries at all, mate. So just a little quick introduction here for everybody that's listening. We're veering away from the standard In All Earnest podcast, and we're going to be just focusing on the lead up to Michael Jordan's rookie season in the NBA, and that also will encompass the closing month or so of his college season, which we'll briefly touch on now, and the Olympic trials for Team USA. The 1984 Olympics were held in Los Angeles, so we're going to be covering the trials, the mini camp, and the exhibition games that led up to Team USA taking on the world at the games where they won gold. And then also we're going to be chatting about the lead up to the NBA season itself of 1985. So we're going to be covering all things in between, and it should be a fun, exciting project.
Yes, mate, it's a real thrill to be able to break down MJ's first season. And throughout the exercise, I've already picked up on several things that I wasn't aware of already. It would have been wonderful to have had today's coverage of the 84-85 season with the social media and whatnot that we have today, but I don't think that his rookie year would have had the mystique attached to it like it has today, mate.
Yep, exactly right, mate. And as of when we're recording this, which is in 2014, there's less than 30 games from Jordan's rookie season that actually exist in the trading community as far as people who collect the games and have access to what he did and could see what he did during that rookie season. So barely a third of his actual rookie campaign is captured on DVD at this stage, which is quite amazing too. So we've come across some great articles and bits and pieces of information that has been sourced thanks to the wonders of the internet. I've been very close friends with Professor Google in the last couple of months in the lead up to this project getting off the ground. So have found some great things which we'll be touching on and chatting about that will really help us analyse and look back on this entry into the NBA of one of the greatest of all time, which happens to be 30 years this coming season. So it's going to be a great celebration that we'll get into.
You mentioned those less than 30 games that are in circulation. I've been fortunate enough to get a number of those games on DVD. And as a Jordan fan of 25 years, watching his rookie games, I just find them fascinating to see what he was like as a raw first-year player and what the squads were like that he played on. Not to mention the first-time reactions of commentators who had never seen him play before or who had seen very little of him, and especially with that jump that he made from being obviously a very good player in college at North Carolina to the rookie phenom that he was in 85. Seeing those first-time reactions, it was all brand new to them then.
Yeah, that's a great point that now when you look back on Jordan highlights that we see on TV and YouTube and NBA TV and wherever else, you just accept the adulation that is heaped on Jordan from all the things he did throughout his career, but very rarely you'll see some of the stuff that we'll be actually chatting about that relates to this rookie season and even prior to that, the lead up to the actual Olympic Games themselves, which I've found quite fascinating as we've been researching along the way as well. So some good times ahead.
Agreed.
1984, Michael Jordan's final season at North Carolina.
It was March of 1984 when he finished up his UNC career. In mid-March, he was named an AP All-American, and the others included Wayman Tisdale from Oklahoma. We've got Sam Perkins of UNC, so a fellow teammate. Patrick Ewing, of course, who he'd have many great battles with in the NBA also, from the Georgetown Hoyas. He was a junior at that stage. And Hakeem Olajuwon was the Houston junior as well. So they were the 5 AP All-Americans. So he earned himself that great honour amongst many others in that incredible collegiate career that he had. And that was in March of 84. His final game itself was actually played on March the 22nd against Indiana, who were coached by his future Olympic head coach of Bobby Knight, and the Hoosiers defeated the Tar Heels 72-68 in the East Regional semi-final. In the 101 games he played in total from 1982 to 1984 seasons, he averaged 17.7 points, 5 rebounds, 1.8 assists, 1.7 steals, and just under 1 block a contest, while shooting 54% from the field and just a tick under 75% from the free throw line. And of course, he hit what would be the game-winning jumper in the 1982 NCAA championship as well against Patrick Ewing and the Georgetown Hoyas. So a very celebrated career at the college level, and he'd ultimately turn pro after his junior season.
Just from reading some of the articles that some of the 800,000 articles that we've trawled through, Adam, you can see, and until late in the piece, that Jordan fully intended to play his senior season at UNC. He spoke about the disappointment of having to receive his 1984 College Player of the Year award when they had been bundled out of the other tournament by Indiana, and the other tournament was still going on. He then said that he was looking forward to the 1985 season to make amends for it. So I think, as they said, until late, he fully intended on playing his senior year at UNC.
Yeah, he was really undecided, and he leaned heavily on both his parents and also Coach Dean Smith at the time, the advice that they gave him in the lead up to when he had to nominate for the NBA draft or decide to come back and play his senior season, and we'll get into that a bit later in the episode as well. Now, in late March, Jordan was named the AP Player of the Year, and as you mentioned a moment ago, it was at the Final Four, which was in Seattle in 1984, where he did talk about the fact that he anticipated being back in 1985 as well as a Tar Heel. So interesting as well.
Yeah, very late in the piece, he finally made his mind up.
I'll just quickly go through some of the achievements that MJ accumulated during his career with the Tar Heels. As I mentioned, he was an NCAA champion in 1982. He was a 2-time first-team All-American in 83 and 84. He was a 2-time Sporting News Player of the Year in 83-84 as well. He was named the Associated Press and the National Association of Basketball Coaches Player of the Year in 84, and he also won the Wooden and Naismith Awards in 1984. So that's just a sprinkling of some of the great achievements he had from his college career. Now, you did mention as well, mate, early April was when the NCAA championship game was played, and that's when Jordan made those comments about most likely coming back to play for the Tar Heels the next season when he received one of his many awards. And April the 2nd was the NCAA championship game itself. Georgetown, led by Patrick Ewing, they won the NCAA championship, defeating Hakeem Olajuwon and his Houston team. And interestingly, 10 years later, in 1994, Ewing and Olajuwon would again battle for the ultimate honours, this time on the NBA level, but Olajuwon would have the last laugh.
I can't remember the 1994 NBA finals the other way that I can remember the 91, 92, 93 and so on, the Bulls NBA finals appearances. I'm assuming that that's something that would have been brought up at the time, that it was like a 10-year anniversary of when they met in the NCAA final.
You'd think so. Having said that, I can't actually recall it being mentioned, but I'm sure it was. They would have clearly gone through all the history of the lead up to those finals, and yeah, I'm sure being 10 years since they'd met at college level, it would have to have been a key point mentioned at some stage, but not entirely sure, to be honest.
1984, Team USA Olympic trials.
In early April, just after the NCAA championship had wrapped up, 74 players at the time were invited to take part in the 1984 Olympic basketball trials, and one of those players is actually a guy that we spoke with very recently, Aaron, Roosevelt Chapman, who joined us. He played for the Dayton Flyers and had a really good career at college level and then achieved a lot internationally as well. That'll be episode number 48 of the In All Airness podcast. So quick shameless self-promotion, go to inallairness.com/48 and that'll be the episode where we both have a chat to Roosevelt. So we'll get an interesting insight into some of the things that he took part in as part of these Olympic trials.
And there were two players who actually declined invites to come to the trials, that being the Kentucky Twin Towers of Sam Bowie and Mel Turpin. Now, this is one of the few things that I have learnt along the way, that they actually declined an invite. And I was thinking to myself that perhaps this was Sam Bowie not wanting to put himself out there for everyone to see with his leg injury. He's recently said in the ESPN documentary Going Big that he lied to the Blazers about the pain that he was having in his leg, and even had to fake his reaction to a mallet test on his left tibia. So it really makes you wonder if he didn't want to put himself out there in front of everyone and compromise his possible draft status.
That is interesting. And also, I think I've read subsequently that he also, around that time, unfortunately lost his dad as well. So his dad passed away, and I think he even said too that there was a focus he wanted to add on his college career as far as graduation as well. And they were a couple more of the reasons behind the scenes why he didn't want to take part. So it is interesting, and particularly given the history of how his career turned out at NBA level and the injuries that he continued to suffer, unfortunately. One of the articles that we did source in the lead up to this chat, mate, is titled Bowie Turpin Won't Attend Olympic Trials, and I'll quickly just quote a little bit from that. It says, Sam Bowie and Melvin Turpin, of course we'd go on to know him as Mel Turpin at NBA level, or at least I would, of the University of Kentucky have decided not to attend trials for the United States Olympic basketball team. It was announced Friday. The seniors, known as Kentucky's Twin Towers, turned down invitations for personal reasons. So, yeah, that just sort of adds a bit more weight to what you said.
And that documentary itself, Going Big, is actually a fantastic insight into the college game and the NBA in this era that we're speaking about around the 1985 season, Adam.
Yeah, it's one of the great documentaries there, and it's got some really great footage as well that I'd never seen before, and it just adds to the overall appeal of the whole story itself. So definitely worth checking out as well. Now, of those 74 players, and I did read in some articles it says 72, in other articles it says 74, of those players that were invited, I must note that members from USA's gold medal winning Pan American Games, which took place in 1983 in Caracas, Venezuela, they were automatic invitees to the 84 trials. And then on top of that, of course, there were a whole sprinkling of other players that most listeners to this episode will be familiar with. I'll go through some of those names quickly now. I won't bore everybody to death and read them all out, but there's another article here which is entitled Olympic Trials. The Amateur Basketball Association of the USA, Tuesday, announced the 74 players to be invited to the 84 Olympic basketball trials. The Olympic trials will be held at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, April 17 to 22, under the direction of Olympic coach Bob Knight and the ABA USA Games Committee. Now, some of these players that we'll be familiar with are Steve Alford, who's now the current coach of UCLA, Charles Barkley, Len Bias, Sam Bowie, Michael Cage, Roosevelt Chapman, Lorenzo Charles, Tyrone Corbin, who's the current Jazz head coach as we record this, Del Curry, Johnny Dawkins, who's the current head coach at Stanford, Joe Dumars, who recently finished up with the Detroit Pistons. We've got Patrick Ewing, Vern Fleming, AC Green, Jay Humphries, Michael Jordan, of course, Joe Klein, who's currently an assistant coach at the University of Arkansas, Little Rock. We've got John Koncak, Larry Kristoviak, Karl Malone, Danny Manning, and Manning's currently the head coach at Wake Forest. Chris Mullin, Sam Perkins, Chuck Person, we've got Ed Pinkney, Terry Porter, who's currently an assistant coach with the Timberwolves, Mark Price, Alvin Robertson, Kenny Smith, Terrence Stansbury, John Stockton, who else we got? Roy Tarpley, Wayman Tisdale, Jeff Turner, Mel Turpin, Kenny Walker, Dwayne the Pearl Washington, John Hot Rod Williams, and also Leon Wood as well, who's currently an NBA referee. So that's a sprinkling of some of the names of the 70-plus invitees that most people will be aware of, mate.
Quite an array of NBA and big basketball names that are now well known for a variety of reasons.
The Olympic trials commenced on April the 17th, and it was at Indiana University's Fieldhouse in Bloomington, Indiana. As I mentioned a moment ago, mate, we chatted to Roosevelt Chapman, who was an integral part of his team's success getting to the Elite Eight in the 1984 NCAA tourney. What we've actually just done here, mate, is put together a few of the sound bites about his experiences from the Olympic trials.
1984 Olympic trials participant, Roosevelt Chapman.
Roosevelt, I've got a few questions surrounding the other trials themselves. What was the accommodation set up during the other trials? Did you have to share rooms with other players? And are you able to share any stories with us about spending so much time with these guys in close quarters?
Sure. My roommate was Antoine Carr, played at Wichita State, played at Utah and a few other teams in the NBA. He was my roommate, and we became very good friends. But one of the best stories that I can recall during the Olympic trials wasn't even on the court. It was in the locker room. I'm one of the last players to get dressed. I'm putting on my socks, getting ready for practice. We have to go in front of Bobby Knight soon. So Michael Jordan was sitting by the bench away, and we had never met at that particular time. This is early in Olympic trials. He said, "Chap." I said, "What's up, Mike?" He said, "Come here for a minute." So I picked up my socks and went over there and started dressing beside him. He said, "You're from Brooklyn, aren't you?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "I'm from Brooklyn, too." I said, "No, you're from North Carolina." He said, "No, I'm from Brooklyn." He said, "I was born in Brooklyn, and at age 5, we moved to North Carolina." I said, "Wow, I didn't know that." I said, "Well, you know what? That explains why you got a little shake and bake in you." And we became very good friends after that also.
That's a classic. I love that sort of stuff.
And further on, during the Olympic trials, coming to find out we had to guard each other every day because we played the same position. So we guarded each other every day. And then if we played against a national team from Yugoslavia or Czechoslovakia, whatever, he would start the game and I would be his backup. We became quite close. There was a lot of dunking on each other. I think he got one or two more than I did on him. He got a few more dunks on me than I did on him.
Who were some of the more vocal guys on the court during the trials?
One of my other good friends from New York City also, from Queens, Vern Fleming, played at Georgia with the Indiana Pacers. Chris Mullin was there too, another good friend of mine. Very vocal, had a lot of leadership qualities, and he's got a very pure jump shot. But they were very, very vocal. And I also have one more other story with John Stockton. We became good friends along with Charles Barkley also. But John Stockton, I played on his team several times in practices, and he would get the ball in the middle, and we have a semi-fast break, and I would fill the lane, and he would give it to me, and I would finish, either dunk it or finish it off the glass or get an and one. And after about 3 games, he told me, he whispered in my ear, he said, "Man," he said, "you're the best wing player finisher I've ever seen." And that made me feel really good. But I think he changed it a couple years later, bet one of his teammates, Karl Malone.
That must be one of the coolest stories that you have, though, knowing what John Stockton became in the NBA, being the all-time assist leader and whatnot, saying that you were filling the lanes for John Stockton back in the 84 Olympic trials.
Yeah, he was a very smart ball player. I knew he had a lot of promise in the future, but I had no idea it was going to be to that degree. But I could tell he's one of those person that has my philosophies. You only get better in the off season. And I could tell every year he came back at the start of the preseason, he worked very hard in the off season.
And he came across as one of those guys that really had that killer instinct when he played as well.
Definitely. He sure did.
Was there anyone that missed the cut back to 32 players that surprised you, considering how well they had played in the first 5 days of the trials, and you're allowed to include yourself in this as well?
I thought Charles Barkley should have made the team, but there was a guy who impressed me a lot. He didn't make the team, but in practices, he impressed me because he wasn't even a college player. They had imported him from high school. His name was Danny Manning. And for his height, about 6'8" at that time, he could handle the ball. He had a nice mid-range jump shot, consistent. He played smart. I was very impressed with him, especially being a young guy, about 3 or 4 years younger than me.
If he was anything like he was in the NBA, he was definitely going to have been a very versatile player, even back then as a high school kid.
Yes. To me, he was like a point forward, like LeBron James. He could handle the ball. Like I said, he had a nice jump shot. He played extremely smart. He was a decent passer. I was very impressed at his height that he could do so many things with the ball.
I think the way the tryouts worked, in the first 4 or so days, you had 2 or 3 practices each day before there was then a couple of double-header games on the Saturday and Sunday before Bob Knight and the coaching staff decided who would make the final 32. Do you mind just talking about some of the things that you were asked to do in those 4 or so days leading up to the exhibition games that were in front of the huge crowd at Assembly Hall?
Well, that particular game, I was asked to score. That's what I've done all my life, and they knew I was a scorer. This particular game, they divided up the teams into two groups. Like Jordan's team was on one side, and Sam Perkins' team was on the other side, and he just divided them. And I remember that particular game. It was a packed crowd, and I believe I played 15 minutes, and I scored 14 points coming off the bench. And I played well, matter of fact, but there were so many players on that particular court that particular day that played well or didn't play well, but they had a lot of talent. It was a very hard decision to get 12 guys out of the whole nation, 77 guys. And I could imagine that was a difficult decision for Bobby Knight and his committee.
That was something that we definitely read about several times in the articles for researching for our chat today, was how much of an issue, as you just said, Bobby Knight had in cutting down the amount of players to finally get it back down to 12, just because of the array of talent that he had to choose from.
I believe he cut a couple of players like I said, myself, Charles Barkley, John Stockton. He more or less replaces with big guys. They were Joe Klein, John Koncak, and Jeff Turner. They all 6'11", 7 foot, and they had a very big team. After Patrick Ewing, Wayman Tisdale, Sam Perkins, Michael Jordan, Vern Fleming, and Chris Mullin, really anybody after that, it really didn't make a difference because they had enough right there to win the gold.
This is NB85.
Being the first guy that I personally have ever interviewed, it was a lot of fun speaking to Roosevelt with you, mate. And he's not a name that is overly well known by too many basketball fans. He had a fantastic career in college and internationally, but actually never played an NBA game despite being drafted. But it was a lot of fun talking to him, and a perfect example of the eclectic spread of guests that you've had on the In All Earnest podcast, Adam.
Thanks, mate. I thoroughly enjoyed it too, and I echo those sentiments wholeheartedly. Now, here in Australia, I'll be honest, I had no idea who Roosevelt was until we started doing the research for this project about the 1984 year and then the lead up to the 85 season. So,
same.
Yeah, it's only when I went through the details I thought Roosevelt Chapman, and then I found out more. And then once I learned how great of a impact he had on the 84 tournament, and that led beautifully into him being one of the invitees as well for the actual trials, it was great to be able to get in touch with him and then have him on the show. And that is exactly, as you were saying, it's one of the best things I love about doing the podcast, is that you can just discover these great stories about guys who had previously not been really heard of too much, at least over here in Australia. I'd never heard of him before, but I'm really thankful that we did discover him and also had a chance to chat with him, because he had a great story. And it was one of my favourite episodes of the whole nearly 50 that I've done to date. So hopefully in the future, mate, you can also join me on some other interviews if the schedules do work out.
I'd love to, mate. As I said before, it helped that it was my first go at it, but also just, as you mentioned, his story is a really interesting one, and I hope that everyone enjoys listening to it when they get the time to do so.
Definitely. At the moment, we're talking about the trials that were taking place between the 17th and the 22nd of April. A day or two into the actual trials themselves, an article was published which was titled Olympic Cages Begin Practice. Just before we even get into that article itself, mate, the word cages, I'll be honest, I had no idea what that even meant in terms of basketball or anything really until I started doing the research for the episode. Had you previously heard the term cages?
No, it was on the same list as Roosevelt Chapman, mate.
Yeah. A quick Google search offered up the answer. A cager is just another name to describe a person who plays basketball. So this article is titled Olympic cages begin practice. And here's a couple of quick things from the article which add a bit more context to what happened during the trials. Knight and his staff, which include about 24 college coaches, began putting 72 of the nation's top amateurs through those evaluations Tuesday. The 72 will eventually be paired to the final Olympic squad of 12. What we did today was simply to try to set things up by position, Knight said at a news conference. Our primary purpose is to evaluate, not teach. These trials will end with double-header scrimmages Saturday and Sunday at Indiana University's Assembly Hall. There's a guy called Keith Lee, who was also one of the invitees.
Yes.
He decided to skip the trials as well. I'm not actually sure what his reason was, but it mentioned down the bottom of that article, Knight said he wasn't upset when players like Kentucky's Sam Bowie and Mel Turpin and Memphis State's Keith Lee decided to skip the trials.
I could imagine that players choosing to skip trials as important as the Olympic trials would not have gone down very well with Coach Knight. I can fully understand him saying that he's not that fussed that these guys decided to skip it. He would be along with Cages and Roosevelt Chapman as three things that I would not have any idea about.
Another article that I'd like to just quickly mention from, it's titled US Olympic Basketball Tryouts, A Sports Fan's Delight. This was printed midway through the trials themselves. It says, for a basketball junkie, the sights to be seen in an airplane hangar-like building on the Indiana University campus these days are a joy to behold. The trials for now are closed to the public, maybe 400 people, media, coaches, officials, and a privileged few watched as the 72 players trying out for the team played 4 basketball games with nothing less at stake than a likely gold medal in August. It goes on to say, the building is immense. Besides a 6-lane track, it includes 3 regulation courts and room for still another. For the trials, portable bleachers have been placed around the 2 courts in use. On the courts, what amounts to 4 of the greatest pickup games in the history of basketball take place. Later in the article, it also says, aside from Ewing, Perkins, Mullin and Wood, other players certain to make the team are North Carolina's Michael Jordan, perhaps the best amateur player in the world, and Oklahoma's Wayman Tisdale. After that, the competition is fierce. And finally, a couple of quick quotes. I hear so much about all the super players we have. I don't think there is any such thing as a super player. Jerry West, Oscar Robertson, or Wilt Chamberlain may have been super. You can count the super players on the fingers of one hand. Now that's from Bob Knight, so they're interesting comments to say the least. And he finishes off by saying, we really have an outstanding group of players, but we're still trying to look for that guy. Maybe he doesn't exist. And again, really incredible as well, because that shows the development. Even though Jordan was really highly touted and an absolute lock for the Olympic team, Bobby Knight at that stage at least still hadn't declared him as one of those absolute stars. So the breakout Olympic Games where he dominated for Team USA, and then obviously his great rookie season and on, it was still yet to happen. So at this stage, Knight was still hedging his bets.
Bobby Knight said to the press that he's not coaching a team of future all-time greats. Now, I know that it was 1984 and the careers of some of these players had yet to develop, but again, with what you hear about Bobby Knight and his personality, he didn't really seem like the kind of guy who would mollycoddle anyone, especially his players. So, yeah, again, not surprising that he wasn't pumping them up too much before the trials.
That's true, mate.
In the piece, Points Porter Fights for Birth, which was in the Milwaukee Journal on the 21st of April, Terry Porter spoke of having to do a defensive drill against MJ and that he was, and I quote, in a state of shock going up against Michael Jordan. Terry Porter ended up getting chickenpox during the trials, but still ended up making the 32-man cut. And he was described by some of the coaching staff as being a very well-coached player, which I guess is a glowing endorsement of the coaching staff at Wisconsin-Stevens Point.
And given the fact that he wasn't playing in a big Division I school, he earned the attention of the selection committee, and then they did invite him back for the mini camp that took place in May, which we'll get to in a little while as well. So, yeah, it would have been a frightening prospect matching up against Jordan. Just referring to another article, mate, quite a good one, which was titled Knight to Make First Cut of Olympic Hopefuls. And I'll quickly pull a few things from here, and there's quite an amusing little anecdote at the end as well. It says, Coach Bob Knight, saying the Olympic basketball hopefuls look a little bit tired, called off the practice session Friday, the eve of the first cut down of the 72-player roster. Fatigue from the demanding 3-a-day trial sessions, which began Tuesday, was a factor in the change, Knight told a midday news conference. Knight said the surviving players will be split up into teams for tonight and Sunday's doubleheaders at Indiana University's 17,000-seat Assembly Hall. Both doubleheaders have been sold out. In the remainder of the article, it mentions things about Charles Barkley as well. And then right at the very conclusion of the article, it says, Barkley missed the 2 news conferences this week, both at lunchtime. So I found that very amusing, the fact that for no real apparent reason other than to indirectly suggest that he may have been eating, Barkley couldn't attend, because throughout these trials, in the many articles we've come across, he's referred to as Boy Gorge, he's been called Rotund, he was known as the round mound of rebound even back then as well, and countless other names that I'm probably forgetting right now.
Again, all this from all these guys, it's all brand new, and I guess, from having seen Charles in the 80s and 90s, you're just used to him and what he looks like and his size. But the amount of times through these articles that his weight is mentioned was quite extraordinary.
It's fascinating the amount of time that he was reported as attending overweight to the camp and then losing weight because of the 3-a-day nature of the trials and then getting into some sort of game shape. I think originally Bobby Knight actually in some of the articles was talking about requesting that Barkley turned up to the trials at about 215 or 220 pounds, which I don't think he ever really achieved, and maybe only in his high school years he might have been down at that weight.
The 24th of April, the Palm Beach Post, there was another Barkley weight comment in the article. It was obviously noticeable, both the amount of mentions of Barkley's weight to us and also, I guess, Charles's actual waistline to the others at the trials as well, I guess. But Bobby Knight said that trying to take Barkley down to 215 pounds would be like asking Raquel Welch to have plastic surgery. He told Charles before the tryouts that he needs to get down to 215, and then I guess he saw how he played at his, in inverted commas, playing weight, and I guess he changed his mind.
Yeah, that's right. I guess he must have thought, well, that's an enforcer. He was just doing some incredible things for someone of his size that you'd think wouldn't be as athletic as he was, but he really had a freakish ability to actually get up and down the court, even though he probably would be, honestly, at least 10, 15 pounds overweight, inverted commas.
I think that's been a bit kind, 10 to 15.
It is, mate. I'm just saying that in case this episode somehow ends up with Charles Barkley having a listen. So, hello, Sir Charles.
Yes. Hello, Charles.
So, on the Saturday, mate, before the actual doubleheader games commenced, those scrimmages, the first cut of players was made. So, the initial 72 was brought down to only 32, and there were some quite notable omissions. Do you want to quickly touch on some of those names of people that did not make that first cut?
Yeah, some of the guys that you mentioned before who didn't make the other squad when it was trimmed down to 32 was AC Green, Ed Pinkney, Mark Price, Michael Cage, and one for the younger listeners, Brigham Young's Devin Durant.
I've checked genealogy.com and I've made sure that he's not a distant relation of Kevin Durant, but an interesting name nonetheless to have at this time when we're researching, of course, given Kevin Durant is obviously one of the top 3 players in the NBA of 2014.
It was a name that stuck out to me. So, I just felt the need to bring it up.
Yeah, and I somehow wanted to justify it for no apparent reason either.
And even gave, what was the website, a plug?
Oh, I just made it up, genealogy.com.
Genealogy. So, as a fan of the TV show, I Dream of Jeannie. I was just wondering maybe if it had something to do with that. But
I might just blink my eyes 3 times and wish we just didn't have that last 30 seconds of talking. But no. So on the Saturday afternoon and evening, the first of the doubleheader exhibition games at Indiana University's Assembly Hall took place. There was a good article which gave a good recap of what actually happened. It was titled Jordan, Barkley, Pace, White to Victory. So it describes the Saturday night games, and it does say All-American Michael Jordan and Rotund Charles Barkley each scored 19 points in leading the white team to a 91-76 rout over the blue Saturday night in the nightcap of a US Olympic basketball trials doubleheader. Lancaster Gordon, Patrick Ewing and Antoine Carr helped the blue team dominate the white 81-66 in the opener before a sellout crowd of over 17,000 at Indiana University's Assembly Hall. With the help of loose refereeing, both games were marked by rugged and aggressive play, which prevailed at the workouts throughout the week. So that sort of nicely surmises the style of play that the players were getting used to during the trials, and that would lead up to what would probably come their way at the Olympics as well. We'll just quickly look at MJ's stats. He played in the second game of the night. Jordan scored 19 points. equal leading scorer with Charles Barkley, as mentioned in the article. MJ was 8 for 13 from the field and 3 of 3 from the free throw line. In the article, it mentioned the score was 91-76. However, I looked at the box score, which I found online as well, and I'll include that in the show notes to this episode. It does say that the final score was 93-74, so we'll go with that as the final score.
The article that you mentioned earlier on, Ad, from the Deseret News, I believe Deseret spells Deseret or Deseret. Bob Smizik, apologies to Bob if I've mispronounced your name. The article was called U.S. Olympic Basketball Tryouts, a Sports Fan's Delight. He spoke about MJ as perhaps being the world's greatest amateur player, which, again, it shows the importance of big men of the day, because despite perhaps having that title as the greatest amateur player, if you look at the ensuing draft, he only went third behind two centres. So it really shows the importance of the centre position in that day.
Yeah, totally agree, mate. Prior to the Sunday night's games taking place, there was another article which shed a bit more light on the rugged nature of the trials throughout that week prior. It's titled Olympic Team Aching, and a couple of the key points that I took from that says, a slew of injuries and illness following Saturday night's doubleheader prompted Olympic trials officials to modify Sunday night's plans. Each game of the doubleheader consisted of 4 8-minute quarters instead of 20-minute halves.
The article also mentioned that 2 players who had been previously cut from the trials had to be recalled from their trip home due to, as you mentioned before, the slew of injuries and illness which thinned out the practice squads. One of those players was Del Curry.
Great sharpshooter whose son, or one of his sons, the other one's in the NBA D League at the moment, Steph Curry, is lighting it up for the Golden State Warriors as we speak and record this in 2014. The 2 games that took place on the Sunday night to close out the Olympic trials, an article I'll quickly read from is titled Tisdale Pacers White Win. It says, Wayman Tisdale scored 20 points and Tim McCormick 16, and the white team overcame a 12-point halftime deficit to beat the blue 81-79 Sunday night in the wind-up of the US Olympic basketball trials. 2 free throws apiece by Joe Klein and Duke's Johnny Dawkins in the last 13 seconds earned the white team a 68-64 triumph over the blue in the opening game before a crowd of 16,823 at Indiana University's Assembly Hall. Because of injuries and illness that cut into the available manpower, both games were changed from the usual 20-minute halves to 4 8-minute quarters. Patrick Ewing, suffering from a cold, missed the second game, sitting in warm-up clothes on the blue bench. So for the second game of the night, the one that had MJ in it, his team lost by 2 points. He scored 15 points. Leon Wood had 18 points. And as it mentioned in the article there, Wayman Tisdale had 20 points and was the top scorer. That concluded the actual trials themselves. It was Monday the 23rd of April where the preliminary squad was announced, so Bobby Knight reduced the team down to 20 players total. Bobby Knight would ultimately decide his final 12-man roster on Wednesday the 27th of June, even though he actually had a July 14 deadline to advise the International Olympic Committee. There's an article which broke down, well, there was many articles which broke down who the final 20 players were, but one of them in particular I'm looking at is titled Ewing Jordan on list of final 20 on Olympic team. And a couple of key points from that. Dave Gavitt, chairman of the selection committee, announced the cuts at a morning news conference after he and coach Bobby Knight met with the players. The 20-player roster must be trimmed to 12 by July 14, 2 weeks before the Olympics in Los Angeles. And as I just mentioned, Bobby Knight decided on the roster before the end of June, so he was obviously quite adamant of who the final 12 would be. It does say Terry Porter, his tryout will continue when the team reconvenes May 10 to 15 at Indiana University, and it says, as a result of Porter's illness and a wave of injuries, Del Curry of Virginia Tech and Roosevelt Chapman of Dayton were retained for the weekend. They were eligible to make the cut but failed to do so. To finish off the article, it says, comprising the selection committee were, and some of the names are Gavitt, as I said, who was with the Big East Conference at that time. We've got other notable names like Wayne Embry from the Milwaukee Bucks, Dean Smith, North Carolina, and John Thompson of Georgetown. So a really impressive selection of names on hand as well for the actual choosing of the team, mate.
Several of the articles spoke of the shortage in the 20-man squad of pure point guards. In the Spokesman Review on the 23rd of April, an unnamed Chicago Tribune writer also spoke about MJ's versatility to play both the guard and forward position, which was important as Bobby Knight had stated earlier that he wanted versatile players in the squad. So Jordan's versatility, as stated here, to play the 1, 2 or 3 was going to be an important aspect to the Olympic team. In an article from the Dispatch on the 25th of April in 1984, entitled A Golden Team by Jim Boyce, B-U-I-C-E, Buse, he spoke about the ability of Michael Jordan to play the point, perhaps in a backcourt duo with Chris Mullin, if Jordan was at the point.
Very quickly, I'll go through the final 20 names that made the squad. All but one of these players I was familiar with, and I'll talk about the other one in a moment. The names were Steve Alford, Charles Barkley, Johnny Dawkins, Patrick Ewing, Vern Fleming, Lancaster Gordon, Michael Jordan, Joe Klein, John Concack, Maurice Margin, Tim McCormick, Chris Mullin, Sam Perkins, Chuck Person, Terry Porter, Alvin Robertson, John Stockton, Wayman Tisdale, Jeff Turner and Leon Wood. Now, out of those names, the only one I had not heard of previously was Maurice Margin, and I did try to track him down online somewhere to find out more about him, but details were quite scarce, to say the least. So a great collection of 20 names that ultimately would be vying for that final 12-man roster spot. Now, mate, that concluded the trials and gave them the final 20 players which they were going to work with to select the 12-man US team at the Olympics itself. But in between that ending and then the mini camp in May, which took place with those remaining 20 players, college players were still deciding whether or not they were going to turn pro.
1984, pre-NBA draft.
An article on April the 28th titled, No Fooling, Hakeem to Turn Pro. Amongst other things, it does say, Houston's 7-foot All-America center was one of 2 players who announced Friday that they were skipping their senior year in college and making themselves available for the June 19 National Basketball Association draft. Charles Barkley of Auburn, a standout in the recent Olympic basketball trials, also announced that he would turn pro, and there were reports of several others on the verge. North Carolina's Michael Jordan, an All-America and Player of the Year in college basketball this past season, is awaiting Dean Smith's advice on whether to turn pro. So still at that stage, MJ was undecided. They had up until May the 5th, a midnight deadline for them to submit their draft applications, and that leads in nicely, mate, to a press conference that happened on that last day that is very famous to this day.
Yeah, and it was only about an hour and a half before the press conference that, on the advice from Coach Smith and I guess from his parents as well, that Michael actually decided that he was going to turn pro. There's a famous piece of footage from the video Come Fly With Me, where he's sitting next to Dean Smith and Coach Smith. In the press conference, he spoke about the possibility of Jordan injuring himself in his senior season, which could hurt his draft chances in the future and also his earning capability. There's an article from the Gainesville Sun on the 6th of May entitled Michael Jordan to Turn Pro, Wayman Tisdale to Stay in School. They spoke about how Jordan and another undergraduate, Hakeem Olajuwon, were expected to go 1 and 2 in the draft to open up the press conference where Michael announced that he was turning pro. Dean Smith opened up with the words, Michael is renouncing his college eligibility and will be eligible for the professional draft. And then, of course, there was the piece from MJ himself, which I can remember off the top of my head from having watched Come Fly With Me, God knows how many times, where he says, to tell you the truth, I really just decided about an hour and a half ago. I talked to Coach this morning and I was 50-50, but he helped me and my parents helped me and everything looks bright for me. Hopefully the future holds the best for me, and I thought it would be better to start now while I'm young.
Couldn't have said it any better, mate. If you've reeled it off word for word from Come Fly With Me, one of the great moments in the history of Jordan, really, as far as following his story along. And imagine these days, as you mentioned right near the start of this episode, the social media these days, players can barely sneeze without it making news. But back in this stage, having footage of that actual press conference to then go into that first production of NBA Entertainment's Come Fly With Me, yeah, just one of the great moments to be able to see him there and have that look of optimism in his eye. It was just fantastic.
And it's also worth noting that on the day that the undergraduates had to declare their availability for the draft, that Olaf Blab signed a letter of intent to play at the University of Illinois, who was Uwe's brother, actually. So Uwe and Olaf Blub.
I don't even know what to add to that, but I'm glad that you've worked in that pronunciation. I'm pretty impressed with the way that came out as well, so well done. There were a few other articles that we found as well that were from the days following Jordan's draft announcement that you might want to add a little bit of information about as well. Is that correct?
On the 6th of May, the Star News, an article from Jerry Hooks entitled "Smith Wants the Best for His Players," elaborated on the influence that Dean Smith had on Jordan and his decision-making process, and also wrote of Dean Smith's ability to separate what's best for his players and what's best for his own ambition, which he said is high on the list of reasons why Smith had so much success at the University of North Carolina. He could have easily advised MJ to stay on for his senior season, but wanted what was best for MJ, which I guess goes along well with the other title of the article. In the article, Michael's father, James, also mentioned that he gets a raise as he no longer has to give Michael $2 to $3, and that himself and Dolores took a back seat in Michael's decision, but he still advised Michael along the way. When considering on going pro, Jordan spent a lot of time with his friends like Buzz Peterson. The story also stated that NBA teams had agreed at this point to not negotiate with the Olympians until after the other games had finished, and that previous to Bob McAdoo in 1972 and James Worthy in 1982, MJ was the only other Tar Heel to bypass his senior season. Also on the 6th of May of that year, in the Sunday Star News, Greg Stoder wrote an article named "Jordan Awaits Pro Future." He wrote an article about the possible teams that could draft Jordan. MJ's favourite pro team at the time, the Lakers, would be unable to get him. He projected Jordan to go number 4 or 5 to the Dallas Mavericks, who at the time had Rolando Blackman as their starting 2 guard, or to the 76ers, who had Andrew Toney at the 2 spot. Quentin Daly was the starting off guard in Chicago at the time, and along with Blackman and Toney, he wrote about how all 3 could be used by their teams as possible trade bait if they were to draft Michael. The following day, the Sumter Daily wrote that Dean Smith had said that Michael's mother, Dolores, wasn't 100% on board, but the other 3, being himself, James and Michael, were very much on board with the decision for Michael to turn pro. And Dean Smith stated that a chance for Michael to make $500,000 and also get his degree in the next 8 months was a contributing factor. And the article that I'm mentioning now from the Sumter Daily has that headshot of MJ from Come Fly With Me when he gives us a wink after he makes his announcement that he's turning pro.
Which is a classic moment from the entire documentary as well. I'm sure people will probably remember the fact that he had that fake wink at the camera, and then it kept going on with some more highlights. So after we knew who was or wasn't going pro, on May the 8th, there's an article which I'll include in the show notes, which is titled "NBA Postpones Draft Coin Flip," and I'll briefly read from that. It says, the National Basketball Association investigating allegations that the Houston Rockets and Portland Trailblazers illegally contacted college stars Patrick Ewing and Hakeem Olajuwon has postponed Thursday's coin flip to determine which team picks first in the June 19 draft. So that was quite interesting. I had no idea about that. And it also just has a quote from Olajuwon in larger text, which says, "I know it's not true." And it says Hakeem Olajuwon denying any professional contact. Obviously, it was very important for these guys to have no involvement with the professional teams prior to them actually entering the NBA. And of course, that would lead into sort of draft tampering and whatnot as well. So it was obviously a very dicey subject. So that was the initial coin flip was actually end up being postponed.
It's also interesting that Patrick Ewing was one of the guys that was linked to that, to the Trailblazers and Rockets having spoken to some college players, because as we all know now, Ewing didn't come out until the other following year and was of course the first ever lottery pick in the 1985 draft. And it was just after the NBA did this that it was reported that the Soviet Union had actually pulled out of participating in the 1984 games, which was interesting after the US had done the same back in 1980 during the Moscow Games.
Yeah, that's true. And speaking of Sam Bowie from earlier in our discussion, he was selected for the 1980 Team USA, but of course, due to that boycott, never actually played alongside other guys, including Isaiah Thomas, at least from the top of my head. So unfortunately, they never had a chance to represent their country. And Thomas, of course, missed out in 1992 due to the somewhat controversial omission of him, led in most part by Michael Jordan.
Indeed, and on the 10th of May, the Star News reported from the Associated Press that Jordan said that the Soviet Union pulling out of the games, and I quote, Michael, won't dim his desire, and big deal, the show must go on. And just having a look at what may have been a possible squad for the 1984 Soviet Union men's basketball team at the 84 Olympics, I've had a look through the other names from the 1983 Eurobasket squad. Only one name out of the squad is one that I recognise, that being Arvydas Sabonis. And Jordan actually said that Dean Smith had told him that the Soviets wouldn't have been their biggest competition anyway. So no great loss, I don't think.
Some interesting thoughts there from all concerned. From May the 10th until May the 15th, there was a mini camp at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, and the final 20 players resumed their training camp. And there's an article which is titled Night Enjoying Mini Camp. And I'll quickly read a bit from that as well, because this adds some good insight into what actually happened during these days. We've had good workouts since Thursday night, said Knight during a news conference Sunday at the midway point of his mini camp for Olympic hopefuls. We spent Thursday night, Friday morning and Saturday morning trying to structure some things offensively and defensively that they could play from, and then worked on some control 4-on-4 and 5-on-5 play. Later on in the article, it goes on to say, Knight believes competing for one of the 12 spots on the team he'll take to Los Angeles is certainly the most pressure that these kids have probably been under. These kids have gone from the tremendous pool of players available to us all the way down to just 20, he said. And then we have a tough time reducing that to 16, and it will be every bit as tough reducing that to 12. So it gives you a bit of an insight as to the decision-making process that was shortly to take place.
And you mentioned about the other squad being cut back to 16, an article on the 14th of May from the Milwaukee Sentinel, and a journalist unfortunately named Jeff Hitler.
Double T,
of course, not the same spelling, so I'm sure no relation whatsoever. Spoke about the squad being cut back by 4 players to the aforementioned 16. Those 4 players cut at that point in time were Terry Porter, Charles Barkley, John Stockton, and Maurice Martin.
Is it Margin or Martin?
Martin, yeah, that's Martin.
I've just realised, mate, that earlier in the episode I referred to Maurice Martin as Margin, so I apologise. I made a marginal error. Yeah, so apologies there to Maurice if you're listening. As it currently stands, mate, they're now down to the final 16 players. And I tried to find some more information online for what happened in terms of Team USA, the players in late May, but I couldn't really source any other information. So I assumed that the players then returned back to their respective homes, and then they would then reconvene later in June, which is what we'll talk about in our next episode. And that's when they then took part in the series of exhibition games against NBA All-Star talent. So is there anything else you wanted to add before we do wrap up this first episode?
Yeah, it was almost a relief when you couldn't find any more articles in between mid to late May, because it's quite incredible, being 30 years on, the amount of articles that you've found that are attached to Jordan's late college career and the Olympic trials. It's been quite amazing, I found it anyway.
Totally agree. I was stunned at the amount of information that's been accessible online, and in the show notes of this episode, and then all future episodes, and just even on the website in general, if you go to inalawareness.com, there'll be a whole slew of articles that we haven't even touched on, which add a greater context to the whole discussion we've gone through. And there's some really fascinating things. They're actual scans of newspaper articles, so often there's a lot of them with photographs from the time, and it just looks all old school because they're all scanned newspaper articles, but it's really cool. So I suggest that if you're at all interested, check out the website, and there'll be plenty more great scans of all these articles that we've talked about, and ones that we haven't even touched on as well, just due to the amount of time it would take to go through. So definitely plenty of things to look at there.
Yeah, it's great stuff for any NBA junkies who love their 80s basketball and in particular MJ and want to learn more about what happened before his entry into the NBA. It's a really good read, mate.
This episode was probably a little bit longer, stating the obvious, than perhaps we will have for future episodes because we're covering a much broader range of time at this stage. When we get into the dates that correspond with the NBA regular season, particularly when it gets to late 1984, we'll be looking at either weekly or fortnightly recaps of things that happened all the way through MJ's rookie season and the 1985 NBA season in general. So the episodes won't be nearly as long in length. So that's a key point that we probably should clear up straight away, mate. It's been good, though, chatting with you about this, mate, and I look forward to all the future episodes and the things that we're going to be talking about. It's going to be great in that regard, but this first episode had to be longer in nature just due to the fact that it was going over a period of months that we've covered in one actual episode.
And I think that I've mentioned before that it's better for the listener to be over-informed rather than under-informed. And as I mentioned before, I think any real junkies of 80s NBA are really going to enjoy it.
Couldn't agree more, mate. So thanks again for joining me, and I look forward to our next chat. In the interim, definitely check out the In All Earnest podcast, which is inallairnest.com. So thanks again for listening, and we'll be back for another episode shortly.
Giddy up.
Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show and share my web address with your friends and colleagues, inallairnest.com. Check out the podcast archive for plenty more episodes with high-profile guests. Follow me on Twitter at inallairnest. Please add your like to the show's social hub, facebook.com/inallairnest. Join me next time for another edition of the show.